Hi, John Green here. Today, we're going to learn how to turn a Raspberry Pi into your own arcade game system. Let's get started. First, we'll need to gather a few things. You'll need a Raspberry Pi. This is a Model 3, but any model will do. There are just a few changes you'll have to make to the software that we download. You'll need a power supply for the Raspberry Pi. This is a micro USB power supply. It's meant for the Raspberry Pi, which means that it supplies enough current for the Raspberry Pi. So make sure that you have the appropriate power supply. A video game controller. In this case, we're using an NES controller, and it's USB straight to the Raspberry Pi. You can also use a Bluetooth controller or any other style controller that you like. An SD card to load the operating system onto the Pi, as well as an SD card adapter so that you can use it on your PC or Mac. And this is optional, but I like to have a case for the Pi. Kind of makes things a little bit easier and keeps everything together. And that's it. Before we get started programming the Pi, there's a little bit of assembly required. Some cases will come with these heat sinks, and they allow the Raspberry Pi to run a little bit cooler than it normally would, because the Raspberry Pi does get a little warm when it operates. And this installation is very simple. You locate the appropriate heat sink for the appropriate chip, and it's a peel and stick right onto the chip. Release the liner and place it right over the chip as such. And we'll do the same for the small one. And while we're putting this together, a little bit of background for those of you who don't know. Raspberry Pi, although it is sharing the name of a delicious treat, it is also a full computer, and a very small and inexpensive one at that. Fits in the palm of your hand. Granted, it is not as powerful as your laptop or your desktop, but what makes it so useful is its size and its cost. They can be used for household projects. Most of the time they have Wi-Fi capability and internet capability. You can plug into an Ethernet port, as you can see here. It doesn't have Wi-Fi capability. This one has 4 USB ports and actually connects to a display via HDMI cable. Also has audio capability. You can use a 3.5mm headphone jack to receive audio. There's a place to put onboard SD card for operating system storage and memory storage. And for those of you a little bit more inclined, there are some GPIO pins that are programmable, as well as 2 ribbon cable connectors for displays. So a very versatile microcomputer. It is Linux based. And you can load multiple operating systems on it. So today we will be loading an operating system called retropie. And this will allow us to turn our Raspberry Pi into an arcade game system. Earlier I mentioned that we need an SD card to set up the Pi. The SD card size that you need is at least 16 gigabytes and no more than 32 gigabytes. So you can essentially go with either one, a 16 or a 32 gigabyte SD card. Beyond that, I don't believe there's any other requirements. Insert your SD card into your SD card adapter, and then this can go directly into your computer to load the OS. Next, we're going to download the operating system and write it to the SD card. The operating system is called retropie, and you can find it at retropie.org.uk. Go to the downloads page, and download the right operating system for your Raspberry Pi. So for example, we're using a Pi 3, so we'll choose this option. And you notice the image downloads as a .img.gz file. That means it's zipped and it's also an image file. Don't unzip it. What we're going to do is we're going to write the image to the SD card. And how we're going to do that is using a special program called Etcher. You can find this program at etcher.io. And it's very simple to use. Download this program and it will automatically write the image to the SD card for you in a usable format. So we'll open up Etcher. Now it's going to ask how you want to flash the operating system to the SD card. Do you want to flash it from the file that we've downloaded, from a link, or do you want to clone a drive? Now today we're going to flash it from the file that we just downloaded. So right here is the file that we just downloaded. Next step is to select where we're going to flash this image. And the SD card's already selected, so we don't need to change it. We simply click Flash and kick back and wait. So what's actually happening here is the program is writing the operating system to the SD card. Now what's happening is, just like you use your Windows PC, your operating system is Windows, or if you use an Apple PC, your operating system is the Mac OS. The operating system allows programs to run, and it allows you to have a graphical interface in order to use the computer. The same holds true for a Raspberry Pi. If you do not use an operating system, then you can't access the Pi and its functions unless you are familiar with a language called machine code. And it's a very low-level programming language that's very complicated and not very intuitive. So many operating systems have been written for the Pi in order for humans to interact with them and make it usable. Retropie is an operating system specifically written for arcade games. Some operating systems are written for multi-purpose uses, like Windows. Windows is great for email and word processing and creating documents and even playing games, web browsing. It's good for a lot of different things. But when you're dealing with such a small computer, such as the Raspberry Pi, it has very little computing power compared to your laptop or your desktop. So operating systems tend to be written only for specific purposes. So for this instance, retropie is written specifically to run arcade games and not much else. I'm going to pause the video while we finish flashing here. This should take maybe a few more minutes, and we'll come back when it's all done. And we're back. The flashing was successful. So now we'll close out these windows and we'll eject the SD card. Seems it's already ejected. And we will insert the SD card into the Raspberry Pi and plug the Raspberry Pi into the monitor and start the setup. Okay, once you've got your SD card inserted into the Raspberry Pi, you can plug your Pi into a monitor, and you can also plug in a keyboard because you'll need that for initial programming, as well as your USB controller. Now, unfortunately, I'm not able to screen record, so I have to use a camera for this display. I'm going to walk you through the initial setup. So the first step is, it says welcome, one gamepad detected. Hold a button on your device to configure it. So we'll press one button here. Let me see if I can adjust so that we can see a little bit better. There we go. So now you're going to configure each button, and you're going to basically map it to functions. And you have to do this because if you have a different remote than the one I do, the buttons are going to be different. So the first one is D-pad up, which is going to be the up button here on the USB controller. The next one is D-pad down, D-pad left, D-pad right. Some of these are self-explanatory. The start button is the start button. The select button, again, the select button. A button, B button. There is no button X on this remote. So in order to skip, what you're going to do is you're going to hold in any button for a count of 1 or 2. And you'll see it skips and says not defined. And that's fine. The same for the Y button. Left shoulder, the same. Right shoulder, the same. A lot of these buttons, we don't have anything on the NES controller for it. So we'll skip them. But if you have a more advanced controller, such as a GameCube controller or a PS2, 1, 2, 3, or 4 controller, you will have access to these buttons. So be sure to program them. Now the last button says hotkey enabled. You're going to want to make this button the select button. And this is going to help you when you're ready to exit a game. It's important to remember what you choose here for the hotkey. So for our purposes, we'll select select for the hotkey. But again, you can choose anything. Select makes it very easy. And for now, you can use your remote to advance to the next step by pressing the start button. And so now you've reached the main menu of retropie. For now, we don't have much to do here, so we will quit and restart Emulation Station. Now here is your splash screen. When we have games uploaded, you will see all the games appear on this screen, but right now, the only option you have is to configure. I apologize, it's a little bit hard to see. Configuration. So we will change that by adding some games. I'm going to pause to switch to the other screen. Okay, this next step is going to allow us to upload some games to retropie. Now, a quick note, most games that are produced and were at one point sold, that includes a lot of retro games, have a trademark and copyright attached to them. So it's really important to understand what games you're downloading and the legality of what you're using. For the purposes of this class, we're going to use games that are made free for any use. But if you choose to use a game that is still commercially available, understand that there are legal ramifications of doing so. Okay, now back to the fun stuff. So for this step, we're going to use a USB drive to transfer games from our computer to our Raspberry Pi. I've installed a fresh USB drive, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new folder, and I'm going to call it retropie, P-I-E. I'm going to take this flash drive, and I'm going to pull it out from my computer, and I'm going to install it in my Raspberry Pi until it's done blinking. Once it's done blinking, I'm going to pull it back out and put it back into my computer. Okay, we're back. Now I've plugged the USB drive back into my computer after I swapped it into the Raspberry Pi quickly. And you'll see if I double click on retropie, there are some new folders in here. Now the reason we had to plug it into the Pi and then plug it back into the computer is to allow the Pi to install a directory in here. And this directory is really important because we're going to place the games in a certain folder within this directory. And that's how the Raspberry Pi knows which game to play and how to run the game. So we're going to place the games under ROMs and the arcade folder. It's really important that for these games that we're going to use today, to place them in the arcade folder. If you place them in the wrong folder, the Raspberry Pi is not going to understand which emulator to use. An emulator is essentially a video game system. It's the program that understands how the game is run. So for example, if you try and put an N64 game inside an NES system, it's not going to fit. The same holds true for this virtual arcade game system. If you tried to run an N64 game using an NES emulator, it wouldn't work. They wouldn't understand each other. So the games that we're going to use today are arcade games. So I'm going to open up the arcade ROM folder, and the website we're going to use to get some ROMs are namedev.org, and this website provides some games that are available for free download for non-commercial purposes. So these games, the owners and the creators have granted access to use these games for non-commercial purposes, meaning this is something that you can use for non-commercial purposes. So we'll choose one game, and if you were around during this time, the times that these games were copyrighted, you may recognize that some of these games were on arcade games that you may have played. Let's grab Crash. And let's grab Fire 1. And we'll start with 2. You can always add more later. Okay, so they're in our downloads. So let's open up a new window here. We'll grab the downloads. Fire 1 and Crash. I'm going to copy them and paste into this folder here. And then we're going to eject this USB drive, and we're going to install it right back into the Raspberry Pi again. Okay, the USB drive has been inserted into the Raspberry Pi. And now we're going to give retropie a restart. We're going to use our NES remote and press start. And we're going to go down to quit. And we're going to restart emulation station. Now you notice when it loads back up, we not only have the retropie icon, but we also have the arcade icon available to us. Now we're going to select the arcade, and the 2 games that we downloaded are showing as available, Crash and Fire 1. So we'll press A for Crash. And the first time we play, we need to choose a default emulator. This is very hard to see, but the third option is LR-MAME 2003. And this is the one you want to select. The game is loading. And here we are. We've got our first retro game loaded up and ready to go. So now I'm going to try and not lose. This may be bringing back some memories for some. Uh-oh. Oh. So you see on the screen it says coin play. This game was originally built for arcade style, joystick and big console. And now you can play it on a device that fits in the palm of your hand. So I hope you enjoyed this tutorial, and I hope it inspires you to do some projects of your own and get your own arcade system up and running in your own home. So thank you very much.